Adyashanti, a spiritual teacher who I find to be a great source of wisdom and inspiration, recently posed the question, in this moment, are you experiencing and acting from division, or are you experiencing and acting from oneness? And this is a question that we should consider quite often, coming back to this question again and again, and perhaps especially in regard to our thoughts and interactions with others. Are we engaging from a sense of separateness, or are we engaging from a sense of connectedness? When we pay close attention to our words and our behaviors, the way in which we interact with others, which of these is being expressed, which of these is being reinforced, that we are divided from one another, or that we have some shared connection? You know, I often hear from those who have studied non-dual teachings and who have come to understand by way of the intellect this idea that all separateness, all division is ultimately illusory, and that there is, in reality, only one unified consciousness, and that each of us are seemingly separate expressions of that one consciousness. And it's important to emphasize that for many this is merely an intellectual understanding, which is to say, it may not actually be a direct perception. Rather, we have heard or read about this, we have thought long and hard about it, and we have accepted it merely as some belief or conceptual idea. And this is not to say that it isn't true, but simply that there is a difference between realizing the truth of something and merely adopting some intellectual, conceptual idea. But I mention this because I often hear from those who have adopted this idea, and they can sometimes be quite proud of it. They can think themselves quite special having acquired such knowledge. They may even feel themselves superior to others, which, when you think about it, is completely counter to the whole idea of oneness. How can one who has realized the oneness of things feel superior to others? It would seem to indicate that one has not really understood it at all, and that the acquisition of such knowledge has only served to strengthen their sense of self or ego. And I find quite often that those who hold to this belief with a sense of superiority can be quite condescending and condemning of others. They can be very judgmental, inconsiderate, disdainful, and abusive in the way that they speak. And I find it very interesting, even a bit amusing, because it's clear that they're just regurgitating secondhand information which they have failed to assimilate. So just to have some intellectual, conceptual idea of this is not enough. Certainly it can be useful, but you have to go much deeper than that. You have to go beyond mere mental constructs, beyond thoughts and theories, and to the very heart of it. If one has truly realized that we are all intimately connected to one another, or that we are one another, how could there be anything but love? How could there be anything but compassion for all living beings? It seems, as far as I can tell, that love, in its purest expression, is simply the recognition of our connection to one another. And in having recognized this connection, there can be no animosity, no hatred, no enmity, no ill will, nor can there be any sense of superiority or inferiority. And I don't think, if we have yet to have some mystical experience or profound realization in which the sense of separation, the sense of individual identity or ego has completely dissolved into that oneness, if we have yet to experience such a thing, that doesn't mean that we can't have some sense of it. In fact, I think that we've all experienced some sense of this at some point in our lives, and perhaps the most common way in which we experience it is through empathy, when we empathize with others, and especially when we empathize with those who we don't even know, who we have not even met. Consider if you have ever felt empathy for a stranger, for perhaps a homeless person on the street, or a hungry child in some faraway place on the other side of the world, or any other person who you have no close association with, someone whose name you don't even know. Now, why is that? Why do we care about someone who we don't even know? Could it be that what we experience in these moments is that underlying connectedness? And it's easy to do this when that someone is helpless or harmless. In fact, often it comes quite naturally. But what of those who are opposed to us in some way, who have divided themselves against us, who are perhaps hostile toward us or speak ill of us, who seek to engage in conflict, whether by words or by actions? Is it possible for us to recognize our connectedness with them as well? Is it possible to see beneath all of that hostility and divisiveness to the very heart of that person, and to recognize their essential nature, which is no different than our own? Is it possible to recognize that there is something deep within which connects us? And if we can come to see this, how might that translate through our words and actions when we engage with others? Not that we don't also recognize that the other perceives themselves as separate, that they may have all sorts of hostility toward you, that they may even seek to do you harm. Understanding this is also very important in regard to how we might engage with them. There's a story from the East where a monk is told by his teacher that God is in all living beings, and that we should try to see this and to act accordingly. And so one day the monk is walking down the middle of the road when all of a sudden there is an elephant charging toward him, and someone is yelling at him to get out of the road. But the monk, thinking to himself that this is God in the form of an elephant, decided to remain right in the middle of the road. And as the elephant approached, it swung its trunk, flinging the monk into the air and onto the side of the road. The teacher happened to find him there all broken and bruised and asked what happened. When the monk explained, the teacher said, "What about the person who was yelling at you to get out of the way? Did you not recognize God in that person as well? And if so, why did you disregard his instruction?" Anyway, the point is that just because you might recognize your connectedness with others doesn't mean that they also recognize it. More often than not, they are acting from a sense of separateness. So we have to take all of that into consideration and act wisely. Don't think that if someone is hostile toward you, that you can just walk right up and give them a hug. You have to be much more tactful. Now, how you might engage specifically, that's going to depend on the person and the situation, and I can't really tell you what is the most appropriate action to take, or whether you should take any sort of action at all. Sometimes what is best is simply not to engage at all. But at the very least, if we can recognize our connectedness, that alone should be enough to tell you what is appropriate for that situation. At the very least, we can engage from that sense of connectedness rather than from a sense of division. When we feel ourselves divided from others, we tend to engage with some hostility, even if it's very subtle. It doesn't have to be in the form of physical aggression or violence. It can simply be in the way that we speak, in the words we use, in our tone, in our body language or facial expression. But more importantly, to be mindful of our thoughts, because that's where it all begins. It may be that we don't engage at all, even through words. We may be silent or even avoid such people altogether, but in our mind we may be thinking all sorts of divisive or hostile things in regard to others. We may be wishing all kinds of suffering upon them. So we need to be watchful of this and to see if we can shift our perspective, to see if we can come to recognize our shared unity, or at the very least our shared humanity. You may have to spend some time going deeply into all of this, really going deep beyond the level of individual identification, to look very deeply within oneself, looking at all the ways in which you might create a sense of separation, a sense of division, and how that creates in you a certain level of hostility toward others. And if you can see the folly in that, perhaps you might also recognize the same in others, that although they see themselves as distinctly different or separate, that it's all a misperception. And regardless of whether or not they ever come to realize this, what matters is whether or not you have come to realize it. So keep coming back to this question as to whether you are engaging from a sense of separateness or from a sense of connectedness. In every situation where you find yourself interacting with others, or even just thinking of others, ask yourself this question. If you find value in this content, be sure to like, share, and subscribe.